The Game Boy Advance is an enigmatic console with a history full of twists and turns. It didn't stay on the market for long because Nintendo simply sacrificed it in favor of other projects. Yet, it's a console that left its mark with its innovations and some controversies surrounding its hardware, which sparked a lot of debate. Today, we're taking a closer look at this somewhat strange era in video game history, the fierce competition brought on by the overwhelming success of the Game Boy, the internal changes within Nintendo during its reign, and how Sony and Sega did everything they could to overshadow Nintendo in the portable market. Here is the story of the Game Boy Advance, the fleeting success of a sacrificed console. It's the mid-90s, and the world of video games is undergoing one of its biggest evolutions in history with the arrival of 3D. The PlayStation and Saturn have just been released, and they are locked in a fierce battle while Nintendo begins promoting the upcoming launch of the Nintendo 64. Super Mario 64 is unveiled at Shoshinkai 95, and its presentation is nothing short of groundbreaking. Meanwhile, after dominating the handheld console market, the Game Boy is slowly dying. Sales are collapsing year after year, fewer and fewer games are being released, and the Game Boy seems to have bid farewell after 6 years of great service and a vast library of incredible games. It no longer attracts the masses, who are now fixated on these new home consoles and this new and fascinating third dimension. Alongside these advancements, the Game Boy feels completely outdated. It's hard for players to see screenshots of Super Mario 64 in magazines, play Ridge Racer or Tekken, and then switch back to the 2D black and white experience of the Game Boy, especially since 1995 is a rather quiet year in terms of new game releases for the system. So, to try to boost sales, Nintendo does something very original for the time. They release a range of Game Boys in different colors, accompanied by the Play It Loud promotional campaign. This was surprising back then, as it was one of the first times a console was offered in such a variety of colors. However, that same year, a new form of competition arises with Sega, announcing and releasing the Sega Nomad, a 16-bit handheld console that allows players to enjoy the entire Mega Drive library, over 500 games right from the start. On top of that, Sega starts talking about another handheld console in development. Suddenly, the Game Boy, which had easily crushed all competing handhelds like Sega's Game Gear, NEC and Hudson's PC Engine GT, and even Atari's Lynx, finds itself up against a much stronger competitor. But Sega wasn't the only source of competition. In 1995, Nintendo itself released a new console, the Virtual Boy. Described as a handheld console designed by Gunpei Yokoi, the man behind the original Game Boy, along with Satoru Okada. Many journalists interpret it as the Game Boy's successor, even though Yokoi himself clarified that it was neither a handheld nor a home console, but simply a unique project. The Virtual Boy was released in 1995, and it was a massive failure due to a lack of support from Nintendo, who preferred to focus on the Nintendo 64 and the new colored Game Boys. The product was also poorly understood by journalists. After this failure, and in an attempt to once again revive Game Boy sales, Nintendo asked Yokoi and his team to design a revision of the Game Boy, a new version but not a new console. This revision took shape as the Game Boy Pocket, which was smaller, lighter, had better battery life, only needing 2 AAA batteries, and featured a much clearer screen, a vastly improved version of the original console. It was released in 1996, and after its launch, the Game Boy saw a brief resurgence in popularity, with sales rising, but quickly plummeting again. Despite being an improved version, it was still an 8-bit console with a black and white screen. Plus, Nintendo had just unleashed the groundbreaking Super Mario 64 with the Nintendo 64, and the subsequent sales boom and promotional focus on the N64 made the Game Boy almost irrelevant. Nintendo was fully aware of this, and internally, they were working on a successor to the aging Game Boy, with the project codenamed Project Atlantis. Atlantis because its reveal was planned for the summer of 1996 during the Atlanta Olympics. Since 1993, ARM technology representatives had been regularly meeting with Nintendo, offering various portable technologies. However, Nintendo was initially hesitant due to the high cost of components and the power requirements, which would reduce battery life. But by this point, with the cost of components dropping, Nintendo saw potential. The project was overseen by Satoru Okada, who had designed the original Game Boy alongside Yokoi. Okada and Yokoi represented two opposing views of the gaming world. Okada was more focused on technology and innovation, while Yokoi preferred using older technologies in creative ways, drawing from his background in toy design. After the release of the Game Boy Pocket, Gunpei Yokoi left Nintendo to form his own company and pursue his vision. As Nintendo is shifting towards a more technology-driven approach, as evidenced by Nintendo 64's emphasis on power. With Okada in charge of Project Atlantis, his vision shaped the direction of the project. Journalists who managed to gather information spoke of a powerhouse in development, a handheld console with a 32-bit ARM processor, a larger color screen, a port for connecting an additional controller, 30-hour battery life, and even a game in development called Mario's Castle. Years later, a photo surfaced from Nintendo that appeared to be related to Project Atlantis. The console was expected to launch in 1997 and would finally succeed the Game Boy, ushering in a new generation of handheld consoles for Nintendo. However, internally, Nintendo was not satisfied with Project Atlantis because it was too expensive to produce and sell, whereas the original Game Boy had been remarkably affordable, especially compared to its competitors. Releasing a much more expensive handheld didn't seem like the best idea. But Nintendo won't hesitate for long. In 1996, an original game called Pocket Monster Midori and Pocket Monster Aka launched in Japan. After a decent start, sales quickly stalled, but little by little the game reappeared in magazines, word of mouth spread like wildfire, and sales picked up on their own without much promotional effort. Riding on the rumor of Mew, which was mentioned in some magazines, the game gradually gained momentum, with sales increasing week by week. It climbed into the top-selling Japanese games and kept rising until it became the best-selling game of 1996 by a huge margin. A true Pokémania took over Japan, obliterating everything in its path. And all of this was for a Game Boy game, a console that seemed to have already bowed out. In fact, it was the only Game Boy game in the top 100 Japanese sales of 1996. Naturally, with its insane sales, the game breathed new life into the Game Boy, whose sales exploded in Japan after its release. The system was suddenly back in fashion, and the momentum didn't stop there. 1997 was an even crazier year for Pokémon, with sales doubling compared to the previous year. As a result, Nintendo decided to cancel Project Atlantis and instead prepare a new iteration of the Game Boy to accompany Pokémon's global launch, which would be part of a massive marketing effort involving the card game, animated series, and video game all hitting other countries at once. It was a bold bet, considering that Pokémon was a game that seemed far too Japanese to appeal to Western audiences. First, the Game Boy Light was released in Japan in early 1998. It featured a backlit screen, but sales were only decent, not spectacular. Nintendo noticed that some people preferred to buy the cheaper, non-backlit Game Boy Pocket due to its longer battery life, but in 1998, a new handheld console was announced by Bandai, the Wonder Swan, developed by none other than Gunpei Yokoi. Nintendo was genuinely worried about this new competitor, knowing full well what Yokoi was capable of. As a result, they began working on a new version of the Game Boy, finally delivering what everyone had been waiting for, a color screen combined with an updated, more modern hardware. The Game Boy Color launched worldwide at the end of 1998, riding the wave of Pokémon fever, which swept through the United States and then Europe. The console's sales skyrocketed around the world. It was a genuine resurrection and an incredible phenomenon. Sales far surpassed the Game Boy's peak years and kept climbing, an unprecedented occurrence in video game history. With Pokémon driving massive console sales, developers flocked to create games for both the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, quickly building an enormous library with new releases every month. And each time Nintendo considered a successor, the next year's sales were even better, forcing them to delay the successor again and again. After over 10 years on the market, the Game Boy was selling better than ever, leaving Nintendo with a headache on what to do next. It was the best-selling console of all time at that point, and Nintendo hesitated releasing deluxe versions of its classic games with added color, like Link's Awakening, Super Mario Bros., or even asking Game Freak, the studio behind Pokémon, to develop yet another revision of Pokémon Red and Green, which became Pokémon Yellow, with a few additions, including color. But Nintendo knew that in the world of video games, waiting too long to release a successor to a popular console opens the door for competitors who can leverage new technology to gain an advantage. That's exactly what happened with the PlayStation, which had gained a considerable lead over the Nintendo 64 and was establishing itself worldwide. Nintendo was caught between two fires. On one hand, Pokémania was only getting stronger, spreading everywhere. When it hit Europe in '99, it was the same frenzy, with Pokémon dominating everything. On the other hand, the longer they delayed announcing a successor, the more it could hurt their future console. But they couldn't rush it. They had to find the right moment. Plus, the longer they waited, the more component prices would drop. Rumors began circulating about a possible future handheld console to succeed the Game Boy. But Nintendo publicly confirmed that Project Atlantis was dead because the Game Boy was too popular to consider a successor just yet. This news, however, was music to the ears of their competitors, sparking a wave of new handheld consoles aiming to do what the PlayStation had done to the Super Nintendo: take over from a Nintendo console. This led to what would be known as the Pocket Battle Chips. In the late 90s, with Nintendo taking its time to release a true successor to the Game Boy, by now a decade old, several companies seized the opportunity to storm the handheld console market. Among them, a few stood out and began threatening Nintendo's dominance in this space. The first was the Neo Geo Pocket, which launched at the end of 1998 in Japan and Europe. It was a technically impressive 16-bit handheld, capable of running over 20 hours on two AAA batteries. It also featured a high-quality joystick and came at an affordable price. It arrived with a solid lineup of around 10 games, many of which were famous in arcades, as SNK, the company behind the console, had a strong arcade presence. To top it all off, it could even connect to Sega's Dreamcast, a feature Nintendo had touted for its Nintendo 64. But the Neo Geo Pocket wasn't alone. Just a few months later, the highly anticipated WonderSwan hit the Japanese market. This 16-bit console, designed by Gunpei Yokoi and released by Bandai, boasted over 30 hours of battery life on just one AA battery. Even more impressive, it was sold for the equivalent of $40, a shockingly low price. It launched with strong third-party support from Japanese developers like Namco, as well as Capcom and even Squaresoft, who released Final Fantasy games on the WonderSwan. Naturally, the WonderSwan performed very well in Japan. It was even compatible with Sony's Pocket Station, a PDA-like device that connected to the PlayStation, positioning it as a pseudo-handheld console. The WonderSwan could even connect to the internet via mobile networks. And both Sony and Sega expressed strong interest in this new console, two companies determined to prevent Nintendo from dominating the handheld market. These consoles arrived at just the right time because in Japan, the Pokémon craze was starting to wane. After the release of Pokémon Red and Green, Japanese players got Pokémon Blue, a few months later, an updated version with new sprites and some improvement. At the 1997 Space World event, the one where Pokémon was everywhere, a new generation of Pokémon was announced for 1998. However, the game was delayed and Pokémon Yellow was released instead, which was supposed to launch alongside the movie but arrived later. Many Japanese fans were disappointed with yet another Pokémon Red and Green re-release, and a sense of fatigue started to take hold, especially with the long-awaited new generation still nowhere in sight. As a result, many players turned to these new, technically superior consoles, instead of sticking with the aging Game Boy. In the United States, Pokémania was still going strong, but it also had many detractors who gave the franchise a poor public image. Things got even worse for Nintendo in 1999, with the announcement of a new version of the WonderSwan, this time in color, and the release of the Neo Geo Pocket Color, which also introduced color graphics. The Neo Geo Pocket Color arrived with more games, and most notably, SNK struck a deal with Sony to develop games for the console, giving it a huge boost at a time when Sony was considered the king of consoles. The Neo Geo Pocket Color's launch was accompanied by aggressive marketing campaigns, including the slogan, "I'm not boy," a clear jab at the Game Boy, with the subtitle, "One day we will all throw away our Game Boys." And it didn't stop there. Sega also invested in the console, with Sonic games being released on the Neo Geo Pocket Color. In a short amount of time, it amassed a killer lineup of games. This was truly the handheld console war, and Nintendo was falling behind by simply not being present. While Pokemon Mania was still driving Game Boy sales in Europe and the United States, how long would it last? Especially since the second generation of Pokemon was still nowhere to be found. SNK took full advantage of the situation, launching massive advertising campaigns. Look at all the ads in the magazines from that era. There's at least one in every major issue, and not to mention all the articles, since the console fascinated journalists and appeared to be the one that would knock the Game Boy off its pedestal. As a result, feeling threatened, Nintendo was forced to announce that a new handheld console was in development, a 32-bit portable system. However, journalists quickly realized that Nintendo was not very far along with the development of this console. On one hand, some employees told IGN that they were working on 2 new handhelds, but then later on, they stated they were only developing one. Initially, they claimed it would be released in 2000, but then pushed it to 2001. It became clear that Nintendo's next handheld was still in its early stages. So what was going on internally? Once again, Nintendo found itself caught in the Pokemon trap. As the second generation of Pokemon was on the horizon, and they had planned the biggest game launch in history for it worldwide. They needed to wait for these games to be released before moving forward with a successor. This is also what was implied by what they told IGN, where they mentioned working on 2 handhelds, a more powerful 32-bit handheld and a special Game Boy Color with internet connectivity. At the end of the 90s, Japan experienced an internet boom, which happened much faster there. Electronic Gaming Monthly provided more details, mentioning a new Game Boy camera, a code name for the new 32-bit console, Advanced Game Boy, internet connectivity for that console as well, and backward compatibility with Game Boy and Game Boy Color cartridges. Then Nintendo and Konami quickly announced the creation of a joint studio to develop games for this new handheld, an alliance that was seen as very promising. Finally, internally, Nintendo began designing the new console. The design process was complex, partly because Gunpei Yokoi was no longer there. He had been the one to create Nintendo's handheld division with the Game & Watch series, followed by the Game Boy with Satoru Okada. And then, of course, they were tasked with creating a successor to the most popular console of all time, no small feat. So how do you succeed a console as popular as the Game Boy? By incorporating the name of its predecessor into the new console's name. Just like the PlayStation 2 retained the PlayStation name. The new handheld would be called the Game Boy Advance, signaling continuity. This time it would be overseen by Satoru Okada, who, as I explained earlier, was more in tune with technological evolution and thus had a different vision for the new Game Boy. Nintendo set several key parameters that would shape the design of this new machine. First, the selling price couldn't exceed $100, which significantly limited its technical possibilities. It also had to be lightweight, and most importantly, the console needed to be backward compatible with both Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. Achieving this backward compatibility was a major technical challenge, since it complicated the entire console's architecture. Satoru Okada referred to it as the main difficulty in the development process. To solve this, he came up with the idea of implementing 2 separate circuits and using a small switch inside the cartridge slot. Game Boy Advance cartridges will be designed to avoid this switch, allowing the console to activate the Game Boy Color circuit if the switch was triggered, or the Game Boy Advance circuit if it wasn't. Meanwhile, the design team decided to equip the new handheld with a 240 by 160 pixel screen, larger and crucially wider than the Game Boy screen. At the time, the cost of LCD screens had become more affordable, and this size was optimal given the processor and resolution they had chosen. The wider screen also allowed Nintendo to port games from previous home consoles directly to the Game Boy Advance, without the compromises that had to be made for Super Mario Bros. Deluxe on the Game Boy Color, which had to zoom in a lot due to the Game Boy Color's square-shaped screen, preventing players from seeing the entire game at once. However, since the new screen was horizontal, they had no choice but to design the entire console horizontally to ensure a more natural grip. This was a big change, as for the past 10 years, people had been used to holding the Game Boy vertically. As you know, at Nintendo, consoles are always designed with games in mind, so at every stage of development, prototypes were submitted for feedback from developers. Developers requested several improvements, which delayed the project, with just the choice of processor and tweaks taking an entire year. Developers also asked for more buttons, leading to the addition of L and R buttons based on the recommendations of game creators. To make the console thinner than previous Game Boy models, the team designed the motherboard with a reserved space for the batteries, allowing them to be assembled more compactly and saving a few millimeters of thickness. They could have made the console even thinner if it weren't for the system's popularity. Ryuji Umeji, who was involved in the console's development, explained, "There are thinner technologies and components available, but they can't be produced in large quantities. Game Boy sales have surpassed 100 million units, and 2.5 million units are sold every month, so we're forced to use components and technologies that can be mass-produced on a very large scale. It's very difficult to design the console under these conditions. For example, we could have added more pins to the processor to make it more powerful, but we had to choose the number of pins that could be produced in large quantities." Then came the tricky question of 3D capabilities. Should the Game Boy Advance support 3D graphics? By the late 90s, 3D had revolutionized the gaming world, and it seemed like a good idea to integrate it into the next generation of handheld consoles. It was technically possible, but Satoru Okada, who was usually all for technological advancements, remembered what had made the Game Boy so successful, as well as Gunpei Yokoi's vision. He decided that due to the target price and, more importantly, to preserve battery life, the Game Boy Advance would be primarily optimized for 2D games, although it could still handle some pseudo-3D effects, similar to the Mode 7 on the Super Nintendo. This decision would also make it easier for developers to create games. The audio capabilities of the new console were also a significant improvement over the Game Boy, and this was one of the features that impressed people the most. Finally, there was one last step: the design of the console's appearance. This was a tough challenge for the team. The early sketches looked too similar to previous Game Boy models. To avoid being influenced by the earlier consoles, Nintendo called on a French designer based in Japan, Gwenaël Nicolas, who created several prototypes. He chose a design that he described as softer, with more curves, but both on the console itself and around the screen. By mid-2000, the console was finally ready. Nintendo sent out 1,500 development kits worldwide to various studios, all eager to be part of the next Game Boy's success. Many were surprised by the machine's capabilities. As competitors struggled to survive in the face of the second-generation Pokémon games that reignited Pokémania, Nintendo was ready to release the successor to the best-selling console of all time. This brings us to E3 2000, which was shaping up to be a crucial event, especially with the announcement that Microsoft was entering the console market. The PlayStation 2 having just launched in Japan, and its global release only weeks away, and Sega trying to keep its Dreamcast alive. E3 2000 was the long-awaited battle of the Titans. Microsoft stunned everyone by showcasing incredible game demos. Sony presented the PlayStation 2 to the world, and Sega revealed Sonic Adventure 2, Jet Set Radio, and other Dreamcast exclusives. Then it was Nintendo's turn. Everyone was expecting updates on the Project Dolphin, which had been announced the previous year, as well as news on the successor to the Game Boy, which was rumored to be released in 2000. But nothing came. At E3 2000, Nintendo chose instead to focus on its final lineup of Nintendo 64 games, showcasing Banjo-Tooie, Resident Evil, Pokémon Stadium 2, Conker's Bad Fur Day, the highly anticipated Perfect Dark, Majora's Mask, and Kirby 64. While these were solid titles, many were disappointed by the lack of news about the new consoles. Naturally, this absence of information led to a flood of rumors and speculation. At the time, Super Mario 64 had set such a high bar that many were hoping the next portable console would be powerful enough to handle 3D graphics, with people even imagining a port of Super Mario 64 on the device. There were also rumors about an integrated camera, internet connectivity, and even one where the camera would allow players to see each other during online gameplay. Some whispers suggested that the new console would be compatible not only with Game Boy games, but also with Super Nintendo games. Others imagined it might feature an analog stick. Excitement was through the roof, but Nintendo remained silent, confirming none of these rumors. Then came the eve of Space World 2000, where Nintendo had promised to unveil its new consoles. Famitsu managed to get hold of some pictures of the Game Boy Advance and shared them, creating quite a buzz. The next day at Space World 2000, Nintendo's vice president, Atsushi Asada, took the stage for the conference. The presentation began with a brief introduction of the Game Boy Advance, but little else was shared. Instead, the majority of the event focused on the GameCube. Luckily, the information panels at Space World provided more details about the console. Panel presentation reactions were mixed. Some journalists were already convinced that the Game Boy Advance was going to be a massive success after trying it out, but others were skeptical. In the gaming world, it's rare for a company to stay at the top for long, and they doubted whether Nintendo could pull off the seemingly impossible task of succeeding the Game Boy. Moreover, many of the features that Nintendo had hinted at were missing. The console wasn't designed for 3D, which was now the hot topic ever since the PlayStation's arrival. There was no built-in camera, and some criticized the fact that there were still only 2 main action buttons, though the addition of L and R buttons was generally well received. Another issue was that, despite announcing the Game Boy Advance for late 2000, it would actually be released in March 2001 in Japan, followed by a global rollout a few weeks later. Asada explained this delay by pointing to the Game Boy's continuing success, with the handheld still selling out in Europe and the United States. However, the design of the Game Boy Advance was universally praised. Its horizontal form factor gave it a fresh look compared to previous Game Boys. There was excitement around its ability to connect with the GameCube, which we'll dive into more in the video dedicated to the GameCube, and features like 4-player multiplayer with just 1 cartridge, backward compatibility, and the introduction of a rechargeable battery pack that would be available at launch. Most intriguing was the new mobile GB adapter, which allowed both the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance to connect to a phone and access the internet, an exciting innovation. But what truly silenced the critics was the avalanche of games announced for the console. Over 30 titles were slated for release, including huge franchises: Mario Kart Advance, which looked fantastic and supported 4-player multiplayer with just 1 cartridge; Mega Man.exe, a strategy game based on the Mega Man series; Bomberman Story from Hudson; Fire Emblem, F-Zero, Doraemon, Castlevania, and even Silent Hill. The lineup was incredibly impressive. The console wasn't even out yet, and it already had a stellar library of games lined up. Usually, the early days of a console's life were marked by a weak game selection, especially at that time when the PS2 was struggling with lackluster launch titles. In contrast, the Game Boy Advance was preparing for a thunderous start. In interviews during Space World, Shigeru Miyamoto revealed that he was overseeing around 30 games at once, many which were for the Game Boy Advance. Meanwhile, at the end of 2000, Pokémon Gold and Silver launched in the United States, unleashing yet another wave of Pokémania. Like in Japan the year before, it was an instant sellout, and Pokémon was everywhere, from magazines to TV shows. It also pushed Game Boy Color sales to new heights, marking the best year ever for the Game Boy in 2000, following an already record-breaking year in 1999. With Pokémania sweeping the US and Europe, the Game Boy Advance and its upcoming games were largely forgotten. All attention was on Pokémon, fueled by the Pokémon trading card game, which was flying off the shelves, and the anime, which was breaking viewership records. The only other thing making waves in the US and Europe was the release of the PlayStation 2, which sold out immediately and dominated the headlines, even making the evening news. By comparison, the Game Boy Advance was barely mentioned, despite its launch being just a few months away. In Japan, Pokémon Crystal was released, featuring compatibility with the mobile GB adapter, allowing players to connect to the internet, trade Pokémon, battle online, collect items, and even unlock the special Celebi quest. It was a great demonstration of the mobile GB adapter's potential. However, it turned out to be a commercial failure. While Pokémon Crystal sold well, the mobile GB adapter did not. Japanese players found it too expensive, primarily because of the high cost of mobile internet connections in the early 2000s. This made the mobile GB adapter a flop, dashing Nintendo's hopes that Pokémon Crystal would drive sales of the new accessory. And then in early 2001, Microsoft finally unveiled its Xbox, showing off its technical specs, planning games, and the dozens of partner studios they had managed to enlist. The Xbox was fascinating, and everyone was eager to see this titanic showdown with the PlayStation 2. While the Xbox wasn't really in the same category as the Game Boy Advance, it was still tough for Nintendo to grab attention in the media at this time. Meanwhile, the Neo Geo Pocket Color continued to generate some buzz, although sales weren't as strong. On the other hand, the Wonder Swan was finding surprising success in Japan. And now a new version, the Wonder Swan Color, was on the way, bringing color and technical improvements that put it ahead of the Game Boy Color in every respect. It was supported by a steady stream of games and major Japanese publishers like Square, Capcom, Namco, and Sega, making it clear that real competition was brewing. On top of that, other consoles like the GP32 were being announced with similar technical specifications but at a lower price point. But the real challenge facing the Game Boy Advance was the rise of mobile gaming. By the early 2000s, mobile phones were becoming mainstream, especially in Japan, where practically everyone had one. This trend was catching on in the US and Europe as well, and more studios were starting to develop games for phones. Major companies like THQ were getting involved, and this changed the game, since most of these mobile games were either free or very cheap. Some mobile phones specifically designed for gaming were starting to come out too, with Motorola and Sony Ericsson heavily promoting them. And they were doing really well. In Japan, handheld console sales even began to decline in favor of mobile phones. Japanese studios were quick to jump on board, with Capcom, Hudson, Konami, Namco, and even Sega releasing games for mobile devices. These games were affordable and didn't require a dedicated console, though of course they were simpler and less advanced. But Nintendo didn't flinch and didn't see mobile gaming as real competition. Instead, they announced Super Mario Advance, a remake of Super Mario Bros. 2, which would launch alongside the Game Boy Advance. This choice puzzled journalists since Super Mario Bros. 2 was the least known Mario game at the time. But to Nintendo, it made sense. They had already released a port of Super Mario Bros. On the Game Boy Color, which was the first Mario game, and had sold extremely well. So this was essentially the second Mario game in the series, suggesting they might have plans to remake the third game on the Game Boy Advance as well. However, since Super Mario Advance was just a remake of the least popular Mario game, its announcement didn't exactly set the world on fire, especially since the market was still in the midst of the Pokémania. Then Nintendo revealed their sales forecasts for the Game Boy Advance, and they were extremely ambitious. They predicted 24 million units sold in 2001. For comparison, the best year for the original Game Boy was 2000, with 17 million units sold worldwide at the height of Pokémon fever. Selling 24 million units of a more expensive console, especially one that wouldn't even launch in Japan until March and globally until July, seemed like a wild prediction. It led many to speculate that Nintendo had some hidden cards up their sleeve that they'd reveal later in the year. On top of that, Nintendo was forecasting 1 million consoles sold within the first few days of launch. These were crazy numbers, especially considering that Pokémania was beginning to fade in Japan. Then came some bad news. Mario Kart Advance, which was renamed Super Circuit outside Japan, was delayed by several weeks. This was a crucial title in the launch lineup because it showcased the idea of 4-player connectivity with a single cartridge and highlighted the console's impressive technical capabilities, including its ability to handle pseudo 3D. It was also the game everyone was curious about, as it was the first Mario Kart on a portable console. Next, Square made overtures to Nintendo, asking for permission to develop games for the Game Boy Advance, but Nintendo firmly refused. Hiroshi Yamauchi, Nintendo's president, announced that there was no chance of reaching an agreement with Square. This meant that the Game Boy Advance would be missing games from Japan's most popular publisher. Why refuse Square? As I explained in the video about the Nintendo 64, Square had betrayed Nintendo for Sony at a time when Nintendo needed them most, and Yamauchi still hadn't forgotten that betrayal, which had significantly contributed to the Nintendo 64 struggles. To make matters worse, Square had publicly criticized the console back then. With this backdrop, the Game Boy Advance's launch was looking less grand than originally expected, but Nintendo didn't revise their projections. They remained as confident as ever that the console's launch would be a success no matter what. We reach March 2001, right before the console's release, and Famitsu publishes a major feature on the Game Boy Advance, praising many aspects of the console. They highlight its ergonomic design, battery life, accessories, processing power, and most importantly, they review all the games: Super Mario Advance, F-Zero, Castlevania, Silent Hill, and more, with mostly positive feedback. They tease dozens of upcoming major titles, but regret that no brand new Nintendo game is launching with the console, as Super Mario Advance is just a remake. Then, Tsunekazu Ishihara, president of the Pokémon Company, which he had just established, announces that a new Pokémon game is in development, revealing some new Pokémon that have never appeared in the games before, and that these new titles will be released in 2002. He also announces a somewhat obscure new accessory: a Pokémon card reader for the Game Boy Advance. However, these announcements seem to fall flat, as Pokémania is nearly dead in Japan, and the news isn't really picked up by the media, which prefers to focus on other Game Boy Advance games. Additionally, the newly revealed Pokémon designs don't appeal to the Japanese audience at all. And then, just before the console's launch, Sega officially announces the end of the Dreamcast, stating that they will no longer manufacture consoles and will shift to developing games for other platforms. Quickly after, Sega reveals they will develop Sonic games for the Game Boy Advance, even leaking a few images, an important ally just before the console's release. March 21, 2001 arrives, and the Game Boy Advance is finally available in Japan. But on the surface, it's not a crazy launch. Very few people are lining up in the streets overnight. There are no massive crowds or chaos. It's a far cry from the madness surrounding the PlayStation 2's launch a year earlier. So, what happened? Where's the spectacular launch Nintendo had predicted? Why does such a highly anticipated console seem to slip by unnoticed? Well, the exceptional launch actually did happen. Nintendo had heavily pushed pre-orders and the Japanese followed suit. So while it didn't look like a massive launch, Nintendo had already sold 540,000 Game Boy Advance units in the first few days. They sold everything they produced, and the console was already out of stock, with more shipments on the way. Every time stores restocked, the console sold out within the day. Within a few weeks, sales had already reached 2.1 million units in Japan, twice as many as the PlayStation 2 in the same period, which had already posted impressive numbers. The difference was that the Game Boy Advance's launch didn't create the same trendy hype as Sony's PlayStation 2. This was a more organized and calm launch because the Japanese genuinely wanted the console for what it could do, not just because it was trendy. The only downside of the launch is that the games weren't selling as well. Super Mario Advance, the top-selling game at the console's launch, wasn't even the best-selling game in Japan at the time. Only about 1 in 4 people who bought the console also bought the game, and it was the only Game Boy Advance title to make the top 10, a disappointing result for a console that was selling so well. The reason was simple. The console lacked a major, universally loved title, something on par with a new Mario or Zelda, or even a fresh, original experience like Tetris. And don't forget that Nintendo doesn't make money by selling consoles. They make money by selling games. Part of the issue may have been Japan's struggling economy in the early 2000s, with people having less disposable income for entertainment. But that doesn't explain everything, since other games were selling well. As the US release approached, several popular magazines ran surveys, and the results were somewhat underwhelming. But on June 11th, just a few weeks after the Japanese launch, the Game Boy Advance hit the US, and it was the same story. Every unit produced was sold. The console quickly sold out. It launched in Europe a few days later, and again, all 500,000 units sold out. Although the release was somewhat overshadowed by the launch of Pokémon Gold and Silver, which reignited the Pokémon craze in those regions, the Game Boy Advance still carved out its own space. The marketing continued the trend set by the previous Game Boy models, with ads targeted at girls, boys, and adults alike, as Nintendo tried to appeal to every type of gamer. In Europe, the focus of the marketing was on the immersive, larger, and more colorful screen compared to previous Game Boy models. Then came E3 2001, and it was all about the console wars between home consoles. The Game Boy Advance flew completely under the radar. Nintendo chose to focus on promoting the GameCube, which was set to launch soon. Since the Game Boy Advance was already selling really well, it was somewhat absent from the event. A few weeks later, at Nintendo Space World 2001, it was the same story. The spotlight was on the GameCube, leaving the Game Boy Advance somewhat overshadowed. But that was only on the surface, because despite this, the Game Boy Advance had an astounding number of announced and released games. SNK announced King of Fighters for the Game Boy Advance. SNK, despite being behind the Neo Geo Pocket, was now developing for Nintendo's console. Namco announced Tekken, and Castlevania Circle of the Moon, which had already launched, was receiving stellar reviews. The same went for F-Zero, with the press being blown away by the game's quality. Nintendo took advantage of the moment to announce a wave of new titles: Fire Emblem, Wario Land 4, Advance Wars, Super Mario Advance 2, a remake of Super Mario World, Super Mario Advance 3, Yoshi's Island, a remake of the SNES game, and even a brand new Metroid game for the Game Boy Advance, which generated a lot of excitement. It had been 8 years since the last Metroid game. Metroid was finally returning, alongside Metroid Prime on the GameCube. Mario Kart Super Circuit had finally been released, with reviews marveling at the machine's capabilities and its handling of pseudo 3D. Even Tony Hawk Pro Skater won over critics, who found the game to be excellent. There was even Doom, a 3D first-person shooter, proving that the Game Boy Advance could seemingly do it all. In addition to that, a big wave of new games was already announced for 2002, which was impressive. It's extremely rare for a console to have such a large number of excellent games only a few months after its release. This success was largely due to Nintendo's choice to design a system that was much easier to develop for than the original Game Boy. Combine that with developers' mastery of 2D graphics, and the console quickly became a hit. And at Space World 2001, Nintendo highlights a new accessory, the e-reader. This accessory allows users to read data from cards, and with Pokémon cards, for example, players can unlock mini-games or get Pokémon descriptions. This data can then be sent to the games. This accessory attracts quite a bit of attention due to its uniqueness and showcases everything that is possible on the Game Boy Advance. With all of this, one might think that the Game Boy Advance is taking the world by storm and is universally acclaimed, but that's far from the case. The Game Boy Advance faces a lot of criticism. First, there's the console's price and the price of games, particularly outside of Japan, where they're seen as too expensive, more expensive than those on the Game Boy, which Nintendo had boasted about for years. Additionally, the highlighted issue with these game prices is the overwhelming presence of ports, remasters, and remakes of arcade games, NES and Super NES titles being brought to the console, along with many others being announced. Many people start to view this as recycling, especially since Nintendo, as the major instigator, leads everyone in this direction with a flood of old games announced for the console. This concerns many journalists who were much more focused on innovation at the time. The impressive aspect of the original Game Boy was its ability to provide a unique gaming experience despite its limitations, such as lacking color and a backlit screen. But those aren't the only critiques. The hardware itself is also under scrutiny, particularly for its difficulty in handling 3D graphics. More importantly, the quality of the screen is criticized for making the visibility of games and action insufficient. While the Game Boy offered simplistic graphics that were easy to perceive, even under challenging conditions, the Game Boy Advance presents much more detailed graphics and faster action. As a result, The non-backlit screen, which reflects light, makes the gaming experience challenging for certain titles, like Castlevania with its darker atmospheres. These criticisms are about to escalate. Some clever individuals start sharing how to tweak a screw at the back of the screen to increase contrast, something that becomes popular in the United States. However, this doesn't really increase the contrast. It only adjusts the power needed for the screen to function, which can actually damage the console. Developers are genuinely troubled by this screen issue. They even create tools to simulate what players will see on the console screen rather than relying on what they see on their PCs. It reaches an alarming level. Nintendo announces that Matsushita, rather than Sharp, will now supply the screens, which suggests an improvement. However, Miyamoto makes it clear that the screens won't change, and the developers will have to work with what they have. At the same time, rumors about a potential handheld console in development at Sony start to surface and gain traction. But Sony remains tight-lipped as it focuses on supporting its PlayStation 2, which must withstand competition from the newly released GameCube and Xbox. Meanwhile, mobile phones and mobile gaming are gaining ground month after month, becoming extremely popular, with standards emerging that simplify game development on mobile devices and even on PDAs. Despite the release of significant games, sales start to decline slightly toward the end of the year. The console is experiencing a bit of a slowdown, even if the numbers remain decent. They're decent but not sufficient for Nintendo, as the Game Boy Advance isn't even the best-selling handheld console at the moment. For most of 2001, more Game Boy Colors were sold than Game Boy Advances, a surprising result given Nintendo's projections. What could explain why people prefer to buy the Game Boy Color, which once again has the best year of sales in its history? Well, the Game Boy Color is cheaper, of course, the games are less expensive, and above all, Pokémon Gold and Silver were released at the end of 2000 in the United States, and in mid-2001 in Europe, having an enormous impact on Game Boy Color sales. Coupled with the late game releases like The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, the Game Boy achieved phenomenal sales figures. The Game Boy Advance sold only 17 million units, while Nintendo had projected 24 million. Admittedly, stock shortages didn't help, but they are still quite far from the company's expectations. Even though 17 million is already impressive for a launch year, Nintendo decides to react quickly, and the Game Boy Advance is about to enter a new era. The year 2002 begins with a major shift. The Game Boy Advance's price drops, less than a year after its release, from $99 to $79. This price cut gives the console a significant boost, but aside from that, the start of the year is relatively quiet, with few major game releases and not much else to report. Then 2 images of the new Pokémon game planned for release in Japan at the end of the year leak, drawing some attention back to the Game Boy Advance, which is struggling more than expected. It's in this context that takes place E3 2002, and once again, Nintendo's focus is heavily on the GameCube, with the Game Boy Advance almost sidelined. The presentations of Super Mario Sunshine and The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker make a big splash, but these aren't Game Boy Advance titles. Fortunately, a trailer gives a glimpse of a new wave of games, including major titles like Metroid Fusion and even The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords, which connects 4 Game Boy Advance systems together. However, the trailer still disappoints because it shows a lot of Super NES ports, including Yoshi's Island, which looks less impressive than on the Super NES, and The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, a game with large areas that don't translate too well to a smaller screen. Thankfully, one game will again shine a spotlight on the console, a preview of Pocket Monsters Advance. Even though the height of Pokémania seems to have passed, it still manages to capture players' interest. Even with less attention, the console continues to receive big-name licenses like Harry Potter, Dragon Ball Z, Banjo-Kazooie, Street Fighter II, Spider-Man, and Rayman. It seems the Game Boy Advance is unstoppable when it comes to third-party support. Despite a somewhat disappointing E3 for the Game Boy Advance, its success continues to take shape, though not as spectacularly as initially expected. Just after E3 2002, Hiroshi Yamauchi, then president of Nintendo, announces his retirement and names Satoru Iwata as his successor. Iwata is highly respected, known for his deep understanding of every aspect of game development. He has a remarkable track record of technical achievements, including Golf on NES, Kirby on Game Boy, Earthbound on Super NES, Pokémon Stadium on Nintendo 64, Super Smash Bros. On N64, and Pokémon Gold and Silver on Game Boy. He even saved HAL Laboratory, where he was president in the 90s. Iwata's philosophy differs from others. He focuses on fun and on constantly surprising players, rather than chasing after more powerful hardware, a vision more in line with that of Gunpei Yokoi. Yamauchi believes Iwata is the ideal candidate. We'll dive deeper into this challenging transition in the video about the GameCube, as it's more directly affected by these changes than the Game Boy Advance. Around the same time, Nintendo and Square finally reconcile, with Square announcing they're developing several titles for the Game Boy Advance, something fans have been clamoring for. However, once again, these are mostly Final Fantasy remakes rather than new games, along with a few spin-offs. This is surprising given that Yamauchi had reportedly said he wanted nothing more to do with Square. Whether Yamauchi approved this before stepping down, or if it was Iwata who negotiated the deal, remains unclear, but the important thing is that the Game Boy Advance will benefit. Meanwhile, a big trend is continuing to sweep across the United States and parts of Europe, modifying Game Boy Advances to add a backlit screen. This remains a significant issue that Nintendo has yet to solve. The screen's visibility is still lacking. There are ads for these mods in almost every magazine, highlighting just how widespread this problem has become. But Nintendo is secretly working on a solution. In August 2002, Nintendo files a patent for a new foldable version of the Game Boy Advance with a backlit screen. They aren't entirely settled on the design yet, as the patent includes 3 different illustrations of potential designs. The style is heavily influenced by the flip phone craze of the time. As information leaks, rumors swirl about a new foldable backlit Game Boy in development, but there's no official word from Nintendo, suggesting the console is still far from being finished. At the end of 2002, Game Boy Advance sales skyrocketed in Japan, thanks to the release of Pocket Monsters Ruby and Sapphire. While many believe that Pokémania was finished, the game's launch proves otherwise as stores are swamped, and the game gets off to a flying start even if it doesn't reach the insane sales levels of Gold and Silver or Red and Blue. It's still very impressive considering the circumstances. The great start even catches Nintendo off guard, as they didn't produce enough cartridges to meet the demand. Naturally, Game Boy Advance sales increase in Japan. This boost is supported by other releases such as Chocobo Land from Square, Metroid Fusion, Zelda: A Link to the Past, Castlevania: Harmony of Dissonance, and Sonic Advance. Around the same time, the long-hyped e-reader arrives, heavily promoted in magazines. It allows players to play NES games by scanning cards, along with Pokémon minigames, and people are amazed by this new technology. There's also an MP3 player accessory which turns the console into a music player, and even a TV adapter to watch television on the console, although that seems odd given the ongoing issues with the screen's visibility. The Game Boy Advance seems capable of doing everything. Nintendo also reveals the Game Eye, a camera that succeeds the Game Boy camera. It offers similar functionality, but can also connect to the GameCube, allowing users to send photos to the system, integrate them into 3D models, and edit them. However, there's also bad news. The Nintendo Space World, formerly known as Shoshinkai, is cancelled and will no longer take place. Satoru Iwata believes it costs the company too much and no longer serves a purpose, as it's a Japanese event with limited international appeal. He prefers to focus on E3, an American expo with much broader reach. Another piece of bad news is the continued competition from rivals. The Wonder Swan Crystal is released the same year in Japan, featuring a new screen technology that's much clearer and more pleasant than the Game Boy Advances. Plus, it's compatible with the large library of Wonder Swan and Wonder Swan Color games, all at a very affordable price. But even bigger news comes from Nokia, which announces the N-Gage, a hybrid between a handheld console and a mobile phone. Nokia aims to capitalize on the mobile gaming craze, which is starting to chip away at the Game Boy Advance's market share. Many see the N-Gage as having huge potential and a fascinating concept. After all, Nintendo only manages to sell 15 million Game Boy Advance units in 2002, compared to the 19 million they had predicted. Sales are down compared to the previous year, despite the console being cheaper and having more games available. Game sales also don't perform as well as expected, rarely breaking into the top charts in various regions. It's a mixed year for Nintendo, but they still have one more ace up their sleeve. In January 2003, without much fanfare, a new page appears on Nintendo's website, quietly introducing a new version of the Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Advance SP, SP for Special. The page reveals the console's sleek design, foldable screen, rechargeable battery, and most importantly, a backlit screen. The release is planned for the following month, which is a strangely low-key way to announce the console. After all, the original Game Boy Advance had only been out for just over a year, and Nintendo likely fears how players will react to the announcement of a new version so soon. It was quickly released in February in Japan and in March worldwide, and it caused a sensation. Even though it was more expensive, it sold extremely well because everyone had been waiting for the backlighting, and its design was praised and convincing. In fact, it was a central part of its development. Satoru Iwata had asked for a console that people would buy just for its look, rather than for its games. It was unanimously appreciated around the world, whether in Japan, the United States, or Europe. Reviews of the console were extremely enthusiastic, and many were happy that it remained compatible with Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. EGM stated, "Finally, a Game Boy that lets you actually see the games," and concluded that if you didn't already have a Game Boy Advance, now was the time to get one. European journalists were also really convinced. Joypad called it the ultimate portable console and expressed surprise at the quality of the system and its new features. What really boosted its sales like a rocket was the fact that it was released very close to the worldwide launch of Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire. Even though the Pokémania craze had died down somewhat, sales were still exceptional, making it the best-selling game globally at the time. It helped push console sales everywhere, with the Game Boy Advance selling at a breakneck pace. In fact, Bandai, which was selling the WonderSwan, decided to stop marketing the device as it could no longer compete. The Game Boy Advance, and especially the release of Pokémon in Japan, where it had been the bestseller for 6 months, crushed all other Japanese competition. On this wave of momentum, the E3 2003 event was unveiled, a major moment for Nintendo, as they had canceled their Space World event to focus solely on E3. But E3 2003 turned out to be quite disappointing. We saw a few images of upcoming Game Boy Advance games, and once again, there were Super NES ports, such as Donkey Kong Country and Super Mario Bros. 3. But beyond that, not much else. There was a brief presentation of the Game Boy Advance SP, and it became clear that Nintendo didn't intend for the SP to replace the original Game Boy Advance, as the Game Boy Pocket had done with its predecessor. Instead, it was meant to be an alternative for hardcore gamers. However, the SP was so well received that it ultimately eclipsed the original Game Boy Advance. One clear sign of this was Nintendo's promotional campaigns for the console, which shifted from targeting children and teenagers to featuring only adults. Some ads were even quite bold, with the tagline, "For Men," resembling luxury perfume commercials. Nintendo was trying to position the Game Boy Advance SP as a trendy device for young adults and shed the long-standing stereotype that Nintendo is for kids, a label that had always frustrated the company because it was never really intended. Additionally, a few accessories were showcased, such as the e-reader and the Game Boy Player, which allowed playing Game Boy Advance games on the GameCube. The Game Boy Player was somewhat concerning for the Game Boy Advance, as it helps players bypassing the handheld entirely and enjoy its library on a TV. It was surprising that this accessory was released so early, as the Super Game Boy, a similar device for the Super NES, arrived 6 years after the console's debut. In this case, it had only been 2 years, and a new version of the console had just launched. The presentation culminated with a major conference from Satoru Iwata, where he outlined all the changes and strategies Nintendo would implement, including a commitment to no longer lag behind competitors in releasing new consoles. Since the Super NES era, Nintendo consoles had consistently launched after their competitors, but Iwata solemnly announced that a new home console was already in development at Nintendo. At the same E3 2003, Sony dropped a bombshell. They announced that they were developing a new portable console, describing it as the Walkman of the 21st century. It was touted as being far more powerful than the Game Boy Advance, capable of reading a new CD format, and was able to play videos and music, a slew of wild promises. And this was the early 2000s when such technology was groundbreaking. On top of that, Sony confirmed that the console will be designed for 3D gaming. Unlike the 2D-focused Game Boy Advance, Sony was preparing something massive, slated for release the following year. The Game Boy Advance would enjoy its last year without significant competition, bolstered by major releases. Pokémon continued to dominate the charts, and the release of Super Mario Advance 4. Super Mario Bros. 3 made waves, as Super Mario Bros. 3 was a legendary game that had already left a lasting impression. Its re-release generated real excitement. Like the previous years, 2003 was packed with excellent games, including new franchises like Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, Boktai, developed by Hideo Kojima, with a cartridge that featured a UV sensor used as a gameplay element, Fire Emblem, with its first entry outside Japan, similar to Advance Wars, and WarioWare, with its brilliant minigame concept. There were also many familiar licenses such as Mickey, Aladdin, Mega Man, Mario Tennis, Golden Sun, Final Fantasy Tactics, and Kingdom Hearts. Once again, it was a stellar year for the console. Nintendo even announced a remake of Pokémon Red and Blue for the Game Boy Advance, complete with an accessory that would enable wireless connectivity. However, original competition was on the horizon with the release of the N-Gage, a hybrid mobile phone and portable console. It came with big titles like Sonic and Tomb Raider, and major studios such as Ubisoft and Electronic Arts pledged support, developing numerous games for it. Nokia expressed satisfaction with the launch, which was backed by an overwhelming number of advertisements, 5 or 6 in the same magazine issue, with ads everywhere. Meanwhile, mobile phones were becoming increasingly powerful, popular, and abundant, and mobile games were multiplying, posing a real threat to dedicated handheld consoles. In response to this, Nintendo, in partnership with Majesco Entertainment, released cartridges that could play videos, featuring episodes of shows like Pokémon, which could be watched on the Game Boy Advance. This move was also aimed at competing with the rising popularity of MP4 players and, notably, the recently launched iPods, which were quickly gaining traction. But the real star at the end of the year was Sony's portable console. Every month, there were new rumors about the device and what it could do. Ken Kutaragi fueled the anticipation by releasing information bit by bit. And by the end of the year, Sony revealed some images of its upcoming console. It sparked immense envy and promised to be a revolutionary device, especially since Sony had just come off the enormous success of the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2, which dominated their respective markets. The year 2004 was shaping up to be one of the biggest turning points in video game history, and the most challenging year for the Game Boy Advance. But once again, Nintendo had a card up its sleeve, staying one step ahead of the competition. As often happens, the start of 2004 was relatively quiet, except in Japan, where Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green were released. These games performed far better than Nintendo had anticipated, exceeding all expectations. The unexpected success of these remakes sparked new ideas and solidified the fact that Pokémon was no fleeting trend, but a lasting franchise. Early 2004 was also filled with rumors about a new handheld console from Nintendo, tentatively called the Nintendo DS. Developers reportedly received dev kits for this new console, which was said to have 2 screens. Meanwhile, buzz about the PlayStation Portable was growing weekly, with constant speculation about its capabilities. This overshadowed the Game Boy Advance, which started to appear outdated. Sony, who had originally planned a 2004 worldwide release for the PlayStation Portable, eventually postponed its launch. The new plan was to release it in Japan at the end of 2004, with the rest of the world following in early 2005. Sony explained that the delay was to ensure a strong game lineup at launch. In June 2004, the technical specs of the Nintendo DS leaked online, disappointing many fans. It wasn't as powerful as the PlayStation Portable, a point Sony capitalized on by highlighting the PlayStation Portable's impressive 3D capabilities and releasing screenshots of its games, which were truly stunning. Nokia attempted to stay in the race with a revamped version of the N-Gage, which was slimmer, cheaper, and more refined. Priced similarly to the Game Boy Advance SP, but functioning as both a phone and a handheld console. The updated N-Gage garnered more attention. However, it struggled to gain traction because the industry was entirely focused on the impending clash between the Nintendo DS and the PlayStation Portable. In an effort to silence critics who claimed the Game Boy Advance had too many NES and SNES ports, Nintendo released the classic NES collection to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Famicom, the Japanese version of the NES. This collection featured about 30 NES games in Japan, including iconic titles like Super Mario Bros., Metroid, Kid Icarus, and The Legend of Zelda. Outside Japan, however, this collection was poorly received. Gamers were tired of re-releases and demanded new content. Then came E3 2004, one of the most memorable E3s in history. Microsoft mentioned its next-generation console, planned for release the following year, but failed to show any images, making their presentation somewhat lackluster. Sony, however, went all out. After boasting about the runaway success of the PlayStation 2, they unveiled the PlayStation Portable. The console was incredibly impressive from a technical standpoint, and its sleek design convinced many that Sony was prepared to dethrone Nintendo in the handheld market. Next, it was Nintendo's turn.
We know that this is your third stop on the press tour over the last 24 hours. We know what you've seen and heard, so let me draw a comparison. One of our competitors is a manufacturer in Japan who wants to capture every one of your entertainment dollars, transporting all your content between all your electronics devices on their memory sticks. We're not that company. And there's another company out there who doesn't care what you do as long as you do it on their operating system. Well, the wait is over. This is Nintendo DS.
They officially announced the Nintendo DS, featuring a dual-screen design, one of which was a touchscreen, wireless connectivity, and internet capabilities. Nintendo demonstrated games like Metroid Prime Hunters and Super Mario 64 DS, proving the DS could handle 3D graphics as well. The presentation was a hit, and Nintendo even announced that the DS would be backward compatible with Game Boy Advance games, a huge blow to the GBA. By mid-2004, only 3 years after the console's release, and 1 year after the launch of the Game Boy Advance SP, the handheld was already becoming obsolete in the face of the Nintendo DS, which was set to release later that year in Japan and North America. This was a surprising turn of events, especially since the console had just enjoyed one of its best years thanks to the Game Boy Advance SP, which had revitalized sales after a sluggish 2002. The SP had even sold out for weeks in Japan, promoting Nintendo to issue an apology. 2004 was shaping up to be a stellar year for the GBA, with new franchises like Mario vs. Donkey Kong, and the arrival of the first Final Fantasy games on the GBA, generating a lot of buzz. The global release of Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green was a massive success, and Pokémon Emerald was also released in Japan, drawing huge attention. There were also innovative titles like Grand Theft Auto Advance and games with gyroscope-enabled cartridges like WarioWare Twisted and Yoshi Topsy-Turvy. Iconic franchises were making a splash too, with games like Metroid Zero Mission, Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, The Legend of Zelda the Minish Cap, and many more. Yet despite all this, the GBA's momentum was cut short. Magazines and websites stopped paying attention to the GBA, focusing solely on the impending clash between the PSP and DS. The philosophical battle between Sony and Nintendo dominated every discussion, leaving many GBA titles unreviewed and overlooked. By September, Nintendo had shared images of a redesigned DS, further drawing attention away from the GBA. Surprisingly, even before the DS's release, advertisements promoting its backward compatibility were already airing. By the end of 2004, the Nintendo DS had launched in Japan and the United States, with Europe following a few weeks later. Though GBA games continued to release, there was little reason to buy the console when the DS was only twice the price. When the PlayStation Portable finally hit the market, the long-awaited duel between the DS and PSP had begun, revolutionizing the gaming world in the process. Oddly enough, at E3 2005, Nintendo unveiled the Game Boy Micro.
Now, I know you haven't seen this. It's Game Boy Micro. Game Boy Micro. Just a hair bigger and about 2/3 the weight of an iPod mini. But this little package plays every Game Boy Advance game you own. It is not new technology, but it is a brand new look. A new look in the sense that it has the best and brightest screen we've ever put in a handheld. A new look in the sense that no matter how tight your jeans, it'll still fit in your pocket. And a new look in the fact that you can customize it in any way you want with a wide array of faceplates. When it comes to market, this fall, Micro represents yet another morphing of the Game Boy brand.
A tiny version of the GBA with customizable faceplates. While it seemed gimmicky by today's standards, back then faceplates and stickers were all the rage. The Game Boy Micro launched later in 2005, but sales were disappointing. Satoru Iwata later admitted that the Game Boy Micro was somewhat as a fallback in case the DS underperformed. But with DS sales soaring, the Micro was quickly forgotten. Unlike the Game Boy Advance SP, the Game Boy Micro wasn't even backward compatible with Game Boy games. To make matters worse, outside Japan, Nintendo quietly released a new version of the GBA SP with a superior backlit screen, known as the AGS 101 model. As the GBA sales declined, games became scarcer as developers shifted focus to the DS. There were still a few noteworthy titles, like Drill Dozer, featuring rumble functionality, and Fire Emblem, The Sacred Stones, but by the end of 2005, the Game Boy Advance had effectively bowed out, much earlier than expected for such a successful console. The Game Boy Advance was something of an enigma, with initial discussions for its development beginning in 1993 and the project kicking off in 1996. Yet it didn't release until 2001 due to hardware delays and the global Pokémon craze, which propelled the original Game Boy back into the spotlight. Despite its short lifespan, the GBA became an iconic console, largely thanks to its impressive library of games. Development was made easy for the platform, allowing many studios to experiment, and even Nintendo ventured into new territory by localizing Japanese franchises like Advance Wars, Fire Emblem, and WarioWare. These titles, once thought too niche, are now internationally recognized series. With the release of the Game Boy Advance SP, which addressed many of the original's issues, namely the screen and battery life, the GBA was well on its way to greatness. But only 3 years later, Nintendo replaced it with the DS, whose backward compatibility essentially rendered the GBA obsolete. The Game Boy Advance was a console sacrificed, sandwiched between the Pokémania resurgence and the revolutionary DS. Despite this, it sold an impressive 75 million units in just over 4 years, which compares favorably to the Game Boy's 118 million units over 12 years. The Game Boy Advance could have potentially surpassed the Game Boy sales had Nintendo not prioritized the next generation. What makes the GBA so remarkable is that many of its 2D games have aged beautifully, making it one of the few consoles with an incredible library of hidden gems. despite its short lifespan. It's a testament to the GBA's brilliance that it remains beloved to this day. Thank you so much for watching until the end. I really hope you enjoyed this documentary. These deep dives into console history are a huge challenge and take a lot of work, but I love making them, and I'm always proud once they're finished. Thank you so much for your support. Your likes, comments, subscriptions, and shares really mean the world to me. It's great to know that all the effort I put into these videos isn't for nothing. I wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I'll see you soon for the next video. See you then.